Blue jeans, the most American piece of clothing ever made. You wear them to barbecues, you wear them to football games, you wear them on first dates. But in 1968, a small group of men wore them to do something the Pentagon still doesn't want to talk about. They wore Levi's into the deadliest jungle on Earth. Not because they were crazy, because it made them invisible. Because it made them silent. Because it made them the most terrifying hunters the Viet Cong had ever faced. The enemy called them the men with green faces. And according to captured documents, hardened guerrilla fighters who had survived French colonial rule, Japanese occupation, and American bombing campaigns were absolutely terrified of these strange figures who rose from the water at 3 a.m. wearing civilian clothes. Why would elite Navy commandos throw away their military uniforms and dress like they were going to a rodeo? Why did the brass in Saigon threaten to court-martial them for dress code violations while they were producing results that entire army divisions couldn't match? And what really happened on those classified Phoenix program missions that the government erased from the official record? The answers will change everything you thought you knew about the Vietnam War, because this isn't a story about uniforms. This is a story about the most effective killing machine the United States military has ever created. A story about men who went so far off the reservation that their own commanders wanted them arrested. A story about warriors who did the dirty work that politicians ordered and then pretended never happened. 50 years of silence, 50 years of classified files, 50 years of veterans who couldn't tell their own families what they did in those rivers and rice paddies. Until now. Stay with me to the end of this video, because what you're about to hear has never been told like this before. The real story of why America's deadliest operators traded camouflage for denim, and why that simple choice terrorized an enemy that feared nothing else. This is the truth about the Levi's Commandos. The Mekong Delta, 1968. 3 o'clock in the morning. A Vietnamese tax collector for the Viet Cong wakes up in his bamboo hut, and something feels terribly wrong. The air is too still. The dogs aren't barking. He reaches for the Soviet pistol under his sleeping mat, but his hand never gets there. 6 figures rise from the rice paddy water like demons from the underworld. They're not wearing helmets. They're not wearing standard jungle boots. And most disturbingly of all, they appear to be dressed in American blue jeans. The tax collector doesn't even have time to scream before a gloved hand covers his mouth and he's dragged into the darkness. By sunrise, he will be in a CIA interrogation room 50 miles away, and the only evidence of the raid will be wet footprints that dry within the hour. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is Operation Phoenix, and the men in blue jeans were the most feared hunters in the entire Vietnam War. But here's what the Pentagon never wanted you to know. The United States Navy SEALs, who operated in the Mekong Delta between 1966 and 1972, weren't just unconventional warriors. They were a living violation of every military regulation ever written. They grew beards when the Army demanded clean shaves. They went barefoot when the manual required jungle boots. And in one of the most bizarre tactical decisions in American military history, they deliberately traded their issued camouflage uniforms for commercial Levi's blue jeans purchased from catalogs back home. The brass in Saigon thought they were insane. The regular soldiers thought they were cowboys. But the Viet Cong had a different word for them. They called them, quote, one, and internal communist documents captured after the war revealed something extraordinary. The guerrilla fighters who had survived French colonial rule, who had outlasted Japanese occupation, who were willing to fight the entire United States military to a standstill, were absolutely terrified of these strange Americans who rose from the water in civilian clothes. But the terror was only beginning to spread. Why blue jeans? The answer reveals everything about why the SEALs became the deadliest small unit in the Vietnam War, and why the military establishment tried so hard to pretend they didn't exist. The story begins not in Vietnam, but in the jungles of bureaucratic warfare at the Pentagon. When President John F. Kennedy authorized the creation of the Navy SEALs in 1962, he envisioned a force of unconventional warriors who could operate behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and conduct direct action missions that regular forces couldn't handle. What he didn't anticipate was that unconventional would come to mean a complete rejection of everything the United States military held sacred. And that rejection would shake the entire chain of command to its core. The first SEAL teams deployed to Vietnam in 1966 as advisors, but within months, they had transformed into something the Pentagon had never seen before. These weren't soldiers who bent the rules. These were operators who threw the rulebook into the Mekong River and watched it float away downstream. The transformation started with small things, the kind of details that drove career officers absolutely mad. SEAL platoons stopped wearing their rank insignia in the field. They reasoned that the Viet Cong specifically targeted officers and radio operators, so why advertise? Then they stopped wearing dog tags around their necks, reasoning that the metal could reflect light and give away their position during night operations. Then they stopped wearing standard jungle fatigues entirely. But what they did next would change warfare forever. The tactical reasoning was actually brilliant, in a twisted sort of way. Standard American jungle fatigues in 1967 were treated with a chemical called permethrin to repel insects. The problem was that this chemical created a distinctive smell that enemy scouts could detect from dozens of meters away. The Viet Cong had grown up in these jungles. They knew what the forest smelled like when Americans were nearby. But commercial blue jeans from the United States carried no such chemical signature. They smelled like cotton and American laundry detergent, nothing that would register as military to an enemy tracker. More importantly, jeans dried faster than the heavy canvas jungle fatigues. When you're spending 8 hours submerged in rice paddies waiting for a target, the ability to dry quickly isn't a luxury. It's the difference between hypothermia and mission completion. And the SEALs were just getting started with their innovations. The SEALs discovered that Levi's 501 jeans, the classic American workwear, offered the perfect combination of durability, quick drying, and tactical anonymity. Within months, jeans became the unofficial uniform of SEAL Team 1 and SEAL Team 2 operators throughout the Mekong Delta. But this wasn't just about fabric. This was about an entirely different philosophy of war. The regular army in Vietnam operated on a simple principle: find the enemy, fix him in place, and destroy him with overwhelming firepower. This meant helicopters, artillery, airstrikes, and lots of noise. The theory was sound for conventional warfare, but Vietnam wasn't conventional warfare. But the brass refused to accept what the SEALs already knew. The Viet Cong didn't mass in large formations waiting to be bombed. They lived among the civilian population, disappeared into tunnel complexes, and fought on their own terms. The army's approach was like trying to eliminate mosquitoes with a sledgehammer: lots of destruction, not much precision. The SEALs took exactly the opposite approach. They operated in squads of 6 to 8 men, moving through the night like ghosts. They didn't call in airstrikes because airstrikes announced their presence. They didn't use vehicles because vehicles made noise. They carried suppressed weapons, moved barefoot through the mud, and engaged targets at distances measured in feet rather than meters. And that's when the body counts started telling a different story. One former SEAL described their philosophy in terms that would make any conventional officer uncomfortable. He explained that the army was in the business of winning battles, but the SEALs were in the business of making problems disappear. The results were undeniable, and the statistics tell a story that the Pentagon would rather forget. Between 1966 and 1972, Navy SEAL platoons in Vietnam achieved a documented ratio of enemy casualties to friendly casualties that defied military logic. Various estimates placed this ratio somewhere between 50 to 1 and 200 to 1, depending on the specific operation and how you count enemy combatants who were captured rather than eliminated. But the real nightmare for the Viet Cong was just beginning. Compare this to the general American military experience in Vietnam, where the overall ratio was closer to 10 to 1, and you begin to understand why the SEALs became legendary. But the numbers don't capture the psychological impact. The SEALs weren't just racking up statistics. They were systematically dismantling the Viet Cong infrastructure in the Mekong Delta through a campaign of precision targeting that the enemy had never experienced before. The key was intelligence. And the key to intelligence was the Phoenix program, and Phoenix would become the most controversial secret of the entire war. Operation Phoenix remains one of the most controversial programs in American military history, and for good reason. Officially, Phoenix was a joint American-South Vietnamese effort to identify and neutralize the Viet Cong political infrastructure, the shadow government that collected taxes, recruited fighters, and administered communist law in villages throughout South Vietnam. Unofficially, Phoenix was a systematic elimination campaign that employed every dirty trick in the CIA's playbook. The SEALs became the sharp edge of this program in the Mekong Delta. They would receive intelligence about a specific target, a tax collector, a political officer, a courier, or a local commander. They would study the target's patterns, identify his location, and plan an operation that would remove him from the battlefield permanently, or deliver him to interrogators who would extract everything he knew. But even the CIA wasn't prepared for how effective these operators would become. These weren't battles. They were surgical removals conducted by men who had become experts in the art of silent elimination. But here's where the blue jeans became more than just tactical equipment. The Viet Cong operated a sophisticated early warning system throughout the Mekong Delta. Village sympathizers would report the movement of American forces, noting the distinctive uniforms, the helicopter patterns, the convoy routes. When American soldiers were in the area, the VC infrastructure would simply vanish, melting into the civilian population or disappearing into hidden tunnel complexes. And that's when the enemy realized they were facing something completely different. But the SEALs looked different. In their jeans and tiger-stripe camouflage, with their faces painted green and black, moving silently through the waterways at night, they didn't match any pattern the warning network knew how to report. Were they Americans? Were they South Vietnamese special forces? Were they something else entirely? By the time the VC figured out what was happening, it was usually too late. A captured Viet Cong political officer later described the confusion in an interrogation transcript that circulated among SEAL units. He explained that they knew when the regular Americans were coming because the helicopters announced them and the ground troops were loud. But the men in jeans came from the water at night, and they were already among you before you knew they existed. But the psychological warfare was about to reach a whole new level. This psychological warfare was entirely intentional. The SEALs cultivated their terrifying reputation through a combination of tactical excellence and deliberate mystification. They wanted the enemy to be afraid, and fear is a weapon that doesn't require ammunition. Some of the techniques were practical, like leaving calling cards or distinctive marks at operation sites so the enemy would know who had struck. Others were more psychological, like the rumored practice of allowing one survivor to escape from a targeted site, ensuring that stories of the men with green faces would spread through the enemy network. And spread they did, like wildfire through the jungle. Whether all of these stories are true is beside the point. What matters is that the Viet Cong believed them, and belief shaped behavior. Internal communist documents captured throughout the war reveal a consistent pattern of fear and confusion regarding the SEAL operations in the Delta. Political officers were warned not to sleep in the same location twice. Tax collectors were told to vary their routes constantly. Messengers were instructed to travel only in groups and to avoid the waterways at night. The men in blue jeans had achieved something that divisions of regular army troops could not. They had made the enemy afraid of the dark. But the darkness was hiding secrets that even the SEALs didn't fully understand. But this success came at a price that nobody in Washington wanted to discuss. The SEALs who operated in the Phoenix program and similar classified operations were changed by the experience in ways that the military wasn't equipped to address. They had spent months or years hunting human beings with the precision of predators, operating outside the normal laws of warfare, answering to handlers from organizations that officially didn't exist. When they came home, there were no parades, no recognition, and often no records that their missions had ever taken place. And the betrayal was only beginning. The same military bureaucracy that had condemned their methods during the war wanted nothing to do with them afterward. Files were classified or destroyed. Veterans were discouraged from discussing their service. The men who had done the dirty work that the politicians ordered were quietly pushed aside and told to forget. And yet the methods they pioneered would change special operations warfare forever. When you look at the modern American special operations community, you're looking at the direct descendants of those barefoot, jean-wearing operators in the Mekong Delta. But before that legacy could be recognized, they had to survive the wrath of the brass. The emphasis on small unit tactics, the focus on intelligence-driven targeting, the concept of surgical precision instead of overwhelming force, all of these principles were refined in the mud and water of Vietnam by men who refused to fight the war the way the Pentagon wanted. The equipment has changed, obviously. Modern SEALs don't wear Levi's on operations anymore. But the philosophy remains the same. Find the enemy where he sleeps, eliminate him before he knows you're there, and disappear before anyone can respond. The blue jeans were just a symbol of something more fundamental, a willingness to reject conventional thinking when conventional thinking wasn't working. And that's exactly why the generals wanted them court-martialed. But let's return to the specific question that haunted the military establishment throughout the war. Why did the brass hate the SEALs so much, even when they were producing results that conventional forces couldn't match? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about military culture and the politics of warfare. Career officers in Vietnam were evaluated on metrics that had nothing to do with actually winning the war. They needed clean paperwork, proper uniforms, and operations that could be briefed to visiting congressmen. But the SEALs were about to expose the entire charade. A SEAL platoon in blue jeans conducting midnight operations under CIA direction didn't fit into any of these categories. You couldn't put them on a briefing slide. You couldn't show their work to journalists. And you definitely couldn't explain to the American public that the United States was running a targeted elimination program that operated outside the normal rules of engagement. So the SEALs existed in a strange twilight zone, officially part of the Navy, but operationally reporting to the CIA, conducting missions that were classified even from their own service, and achieving results that made everyone uncomfortable. And then came the confrontation that nearly ended everything. The conflict between the operators and the establishment reached its peak in 1969. That year, a Navy captain was assigned to evaluate SEAL operations in the Mekong Delta, with orders to determine whether the unconventional methods could be brought into compliance with standard operating procedures. The evaluation lasted 3 weeks, and the resulting report has never been fully declassified. What leaked out suggests a document written in frustration and disbelief. But what the captain discovered would shock even the Pentagon. The captain found SEAL operators who had been in-country for multiple deployments without proper rotation. He found weapons that weren't in the Navy inventory, purchased privately or obtained through CIA channels. He found operations targeting individuals for elimination based on intelligence that couldn't be verified through normal channels. And everywhere he went, he found blue jeans. The final recommendation was reportedly split. On one hand, the captain acknowledged that SEAL operations were producing tactical results that no other unit could match. On the other hand, he couldn't find a way to legitimize methods that violated virtually every regulation in the military manual, and the Pentagon's response would define the SEALs for decades to come. The report concluded that the SEALs should either be normalized or disbanded, and that their current status was unsustainable. The Pentagon's response was characteristic. They filed the report, classified it, and changed absolutely nothing. Because in the end, results trumped regulations. The men in blue jeans continued their operations until the American withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973. By that time, they had conducted thousands of missions, eliminated or captured hundreds of enemy personnel, and compiled a combat record that remains classified in many details to this day. But the weapons they carried were just as revolutionary as their tactics. Now let's examine the specific tactical innovations that made this possible. The SEAL platoons in Vietnam pioneered techniques that would become standard doctrine for special operations forces worldwide. Their approach to water insertion was particularly revolutionary. While conventional forces used noisy patrol boats and helicopters, the SEALs developed what they called _4 operations that relied on silence and timing rather than speed and firepower. And these techniques would rewrite every special operations manual in existence. They would approach their target area by swimming, sometimes for miles, carrying weapons and equipment in waterproof bags. They would emerge from the water in complete darkness, move to their objective, execute their mission, and extract through the waterways before anyone knew they had been there. The water was both their transportation and their concealment. The Mekong Delta's maze of rivers, canals, and rice paddies became their home territory, memorized to a degree that amazed even the local Vietnamese forces who worked alongside them. But the most impressive innovation was something the enemy never saw coming. Unlike conventional forces that relied on reports filtered through multiple levels of command, SEAL platoons developed their own intelligence networks. They cultivated sources among the local population, identified enemy patterns through patient observation, and often conducted reconnaissance missions that involved nothing more than watching and waiting. One former operator described spending 72 hours hidden in a rice paddy dike, observing enemy movements before an operation. He never fired a shot during that reconnaissance. His job was simply to understand the target environment so perfectly that the actual mission would be almost anticlimactic. And this patience drove the conventional commanders absolutely insane. This patience was another thing that drove conventional commanders mad. They wanted action, body counts, something to report up the chain. The SEALs understood that the preparation was more important than the execution. The weapons they carried reflected this philosophy of precision over volume. The standard Army soldier in Vietnam carried an M16 rifle, a weapon designed for volume of fire at medium range. The SEALs often carried something very different. The Stoner 63 light machine gun, a modular weapon system that could be configured for different mission requirements. But their most terrifying weapon made almost no sound at all. More significantly, they pioneered the use of suppressed weapons in combat operations. The Mark 22 Hush Puppy pistol became their signature tool for sentinel elimination, a weapon designed specifically to remove guards silently before a main assault. They also used suppressed submachine guns and modified shotguns loaded with specialized ammunition. The goal was always the same: accomplish the mission without announcing your presence to everyone within a mile radius. Regular Army soldiers sometimes mocked the SEAL weapons as exotic toys. The SEALs didn't care. They knew that a single silent shot from a hush puppy could accomplish more than 100 rounds from a standard rifle. And then there was what they wore on their feet, or rather, what they didn't wear. This might seem like a trivial detail, but it became a defining characteristic of SEAL operations in Vietnam. Standard jungle boots were heavy, loud, and left distinctive tracks that enemy trackers could follow. Many SEAL operators simply stopped wearing them. They would enter the field barefoot or in simple canvas sneakers, moving through the mud with a silence that conventional soldiers found unnerving. The adaptation wasn't comfortable. Their feet became calloused and damaged from the constant exposure to water and sharp vegetation. But it worked, and the enemy trackers were about to discover their worst nightmare. Enemy tracking parties that could follow a conventional unit by its boot prints found themselves losing the SEAL teams entirely. The barefoot warriors became another element of the legend. Men so committed to their mission that they abandoned even basic protection for the sake of tactical advantage. The combination of all these elements created something unprecedented. Here was a military unit that dressed like civilians, moved like ghosts, struck without warning, and disappeared without trace. They answered to handlers that most military personnel didn't know existed. They conducted operations that would never appear in any official history. But the darkest chapter of this story was still being written. And they achieved results that made conventional forces look like amateurs by comparison. Is it any wonder that the establishment wanted to pretend they didn't exist? The SEALs represented everything that the traditional military wasn't: adaptive, unconventional, and effective, precisely because they refused to follow the rules. But this brings us to the darkest chapter of the story. The Phoenix program, which provided the targeting intelligence for many SEAL operations, remains controversial more than 50 years after the war ended. And the truth is more disturbing than anyone wanted to admit. Critics have called it an elimination campaign that violated international law. Supporters argue that it was an effective counterinsurgency tool that saved lives by dismantling enemy infrastructure. The truth, as always, is more complicated. The program did target individuals for elimination based on intelligence that was sometimes wrong. There were cases where innocent people were caught up in operations, where personal grudges got disguised as security threats, where the machinery of targeted violence consumed people who shouldn't have been on any list. But the operators had no choice but to trust the system. But there were also cases where Phoenix operations removed genuine threats, capturing or eliminating VC operatives who were responsible for terrorism and coercion against the civilian population. The moral calculus isn't simple, and the men who carried out these operations had to live with that ambiguity. The SEALs didn't make the policy. They executed it. This is the uncomfortable reality of special operations forces that rarely gets discussed in the heroic narratives. The men who conduct these missions don't choose their targets. They receive intelligence from someone else, often from organizations with their own agendas, and that burden would follow them home forever. They have to trust that the targeting is accurate, that the mission is legitimate, that they're not being used as weapons against people who shouldn't be targeted. Sometimes that trust is justified, sometimes it isn't. The operators who served in Phoenix had to make peace with this uncertainty, knowing that they might never learn the full truth about the missions they had conducted. Some couldn't make that peace. The psychological cost of this kind of warfare doesn't end when the mission ends. But what awaited them in America was even worse than the jungle. Now let's consider what happened when these men came home. The Vietnam veteran experience is well documented. The protests, the lack of support, the struggle to reintegrate into a society that wanted to forget the war had ever happened. But the SEAL veterans had an additional burden. They couldn't even talk about what they had done. Many of their operations remained classified for decades. When they sought help for what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress, they couldn't explain to counselors what had caused it. And the government that sent them to war now pretended they didn't exist. They were isolated not just from civilian society, but from the broader military community that didn't understand their particular experience. The brotherhood that had sustained them in combat became the only community where they felt understood. SEAL veteran organizations became tight-knit groups where men could finally discuss experiences they had kept secret for years. These bonds remain strong today, connecting men who shared something that the rest of the world will never fully understand. But the rehabilitation of their reputation would take 3 decades. The rehabilitation of the SEAL image took decades. In the immediate aftermath of Vietnam, special operations forces were politically toxic. The Phoenix program had become a public relations disaster, cited by anti-war activists as evidence of American atrocities. The Carter administration actually reduced special operations capabilities, viewing them as relics of an immoral war. It wasn't until the failures of the Iranian hostage rescue mission in 1980 and the Grenada invasion in 1983 that military planners began to reconsider the value of elite unconventional forces. And then, everything changed overnight. The Reagan buildup included a massive expansion of special operations capabilities, driven partly by the Cold War, but also by recognition that conventional forces couldn't handle every mission. By the 1990s, the SEALs had transformed from pariahs to heroes, featured in Hollywood films, and celebrated as examples of American military excellence. But the old-timers remember when it was different. The veterans of Vietnam-era SEAL teams sometimes express ambivalence about this rehabilitation. They're glad their sacrifice is finally recognized. They're proud of what the teams have become. But they know the real story has never been told. But they also know that the sanitized version of SEAL history leaves out the parts that made people uncomfortable. The targeted eliminations, the moral ambiguity, the blue jeans and bare feet, and suppressed weapons in the night. Modern SEALs train in state-of-the-art facilities with the best equipment money can buy. The Mekong Delta veterans operated on shoestrings, improvising their tactics and sometimes their equipment from whatever they could scrounge. Both generations share the same commitment to the mission. But the Vietnam generation wrote the doctrine in a darkness that their successors can barely imagine. And those blue jeans became the most unlikely symbol of American military excellence. And what about those blue jeans? The Levi's that became symbols of SEAL operations in Vietnam are now collector's items, displayed in private collections, and occasionally in military museums. They represent something more than tactical equipment. They represent a philosophy that says, effectiveness matters more than appearance. That adaptation is more important than regulation. That the man wearing the uniform matters more than the uniform itself. When the brass complained about SEAL dress codes, they were missing the point entirely. The jeans weren't a fashion statement. They were evidence that these operators would do whatever it took to accomplish the mission, even if that meant looking like civilians instead of soldiers. And the Pentagon finally learned the lesson, 30 years too late. The final irony is that the military eventually learned the lesson. Modern special operations forces routinely operate in civilian clothes when the mission requires it. They adapt their equipment and tactics to local conditions, rather than following rigid standardized procedures. They have been given the freedom that the Vietnam-era SEALs had to fight for against bureaucratic resistance. In a sense, those early operators won their war twice, first against the enemy in the Mekong Delta, and then against the institutional resistance that tried to make them conform. The Blue Jean Commandos proved that unconventional thinking could produce results that conventional forces couldn't match. It just took the Pentagon 30 years to admit it. But the ultimate question still haunts the survivors. But the question remains, was it worth it? The Viet Cong infrastructure in the Mekong Delta was significantly degraded by SEAL and Phoenix operations. Enemy documents and post-war interviews confirm that the precision targeting campaign created fear and disruption far beyond its numerical impact. But the war was still lost. The political will to continue the conflict evaporated. The South Vietnamese government eventually fell, and Vietnam became unified under communist rule. Does that mean the SEAL operations were pointless? And the veterans have an answer that Washington never wanted to hear. The veterans don't see it that way. They argue that they did their job, and they did it brilliantly. The failure was political, not tactical. They were lions led by lambs, warriors betrayed by politicians who lacked the courage to let them win. Whether this narrative is accurate is a matter of ongoing historical debate. What isn't debatable is that the SEALs believed it, and that belief sustained them through decades when their service was unrecognized and their methods were condemned. But their legacy lives on in every special operations unit in the world. The legacy lives on in ways both obvious and subtle. Every modern special operations mission traces its tactical DNA back to the Mekong Delta. The doctrine of intelligence-driven targeting, small unit precision, and psychological impact was refined by men who wore blue jeans and painted their faces green. The technology has advanced exponentially, but the fundamental principles remain the same. Find the enemy. Know him better than he knows himself. Strike when he doesn't expect it. Disappear before he can respond. These aren't just tactics. They're a philosophy of warfare that has proven effective from Vietnam to Afghanistan to operations that remain classified to this day. And somewhere, those blue jeans are still waiting to tell their story. And somewhere in a closet in California or Texas or Florida, an old pair of Levi's sits in a box. They're faded now, stained with mud that will never come out, torn in places that tell stories the owner rarely shares. They're evidence of a time when American warriors did whatever it took to accomplish their mission, even if that meant violating every regulation in the book. They're proof that unconventional thinking can produce extraordinary results, and they're a reminder that the most dangerous men in the world don't always look like soldiers. Sometimes they look like regular Americans in blue jeans, right up until the moment they emerge from the water in the darkness. The brass never understood that. The enemy understood it perfectly. This is the story they didn't want you to know. The story of the men in blue jeans who terrorized an enemy that had survived everything else. The story of operators who rewrote the rules of warfare while their own military tried to court-martial them for dress code violations. The story of warriors who did the dirty work that politicians ordered and then disavowed. The Levi's Commandos, the men with green faces, the deadliest hunters of the Vietnam War. They've waited more than 50 years for the truth to be told. And now you know why they wore blue jeans into the deadliest jungle on Earth.